So I just read Lord of the Flies for the first time, and I am having some really big feelings. I know I'm an English teacher, so this book really should not be news to me, but it was not ever required reading for me when I was in school, and I never had to teach it. So before we get into it, remember that I am working from the assumption that you have read this whole book. If you're worried about spoilers, save this video, come back to it when you're finished. If you're here because you are trying to get out of reading this book for school, that's fine. I totally get it. But I would encourage you to actually give this one a chance. I always give books 100 pages before I decide that I'm not going to read them. For you, maybe it's 25 pages, maybe it's 50 pages. But when you pick up a new book and you're having trouble getting into it, try to commit yourself to a certain amount of it before you decide it's not for you. Because this book started out really slow for me, and by the end, I was literally crying. I also watched the 1963 film version of The Lord of the Flies. It was a little weird, but I liked it. Kind of like the book, actually. It does leave out at least one major event from the book, and obviously it's not going to get into like the inner lives of the characters the way that the book will, so I would not recommend trying to just watch the movie. For this one, you will absolutely have test questions that are not covered in the movie. Okay, so let's talk about Lord of the Flies. What were these kids doing on this plane, and why did it crash? So at the beginning of Lord of the Flies, there's a war going on. The kids have all been evacuated by plane. We know that they're English, so we know they're coming from England. We don't know where they're going to. Doesn't really matter because their plane crashes on this island. The plane itself washes out to sea, and so do the bodies of any adults who might have been on this flight with them. So at the beginning of the book, they talk about the scar a lot, which can be a little bit confusing because the author never expressly tells us what the scar is. The scar is just the area of the island where the plane crashed. So if you can imagine like a plane crashing down onto this island, the way it would like skid and it would take out any like vegetation or anything that was around there, that kind of mark it would leave, that's the scar. First chapter, we meet all of our main characters, but also this is where Ralph and Piggy first find the conch shell, which ends up being one of the most important symbols in the whole book. So a conch, I think I'm saying that right? Conch, conch, I don't know. Anyway, the conch, we're gonna call it the conch shell, is that kind of shell that you can hold up to your ear and like hear the ocean. And Piggy teaches Ralph that you can also blow into it and it'll kind of make a sound like a horn. In the beginning, Ralph uses the conch as like a signal to call the other boys on the island to kind of see who's around. And he'll use it to call meetings throughout the course of the book. It also kind of becomes their version of like a talking stick, right? So they decide that when they have these meetings, whoever's holding the conch is the one who can speak in that moment. But really what the conch represents is order, authority, cooperation, and democracy. All of the things that the boys are going to need if they're going to form a civilization and survive together on this island without a dope. So it makes sense that later on, when like the stuff really hits the fan, the last thing that happens before Piggy dies is that the conch shatters. The shattering of the conch represents the end of any kind of like civilization and order that they had going on up to that point. It also kind of marks the end of any hope they might have had of keeping it all together until there's an adult there again. Right, so let's back it up and talk about these boys a little bit. There are a ton of boys on the island, and a lot of them have names, but for our purposes, I think there are only a couple that we really need to talk about. I also think it's really important that we remember, as we talk about the main characters, that most of them are only around 12 years old. They are literal children. So when we're thinking about the things that they do and the things that they say and their behaviors on the island, you have to remember they're in a situation where they're being forced to behave like adults, but actually they are just kids. Okay, so the first boy that we meet is Ralph. Ralph is the good kid. Ralph is the one who finds the conch. He calls everyone to this first meeting. He tries to establish some kind of order. The kids vote him chief of the island, which actually probably should have been Piggy, but we'll talk about that in a minute. One of the things that I really like about Ralph is that Ralph is a kid who knows what he doesn't know, right? Like, for example, he realizes that he's just not as good of a thinker. Like, that's how he puts it. He's not as good of a thinker as Piggy is. He's humble and he's mature enough to realize that if they don't work together, they are not going to survive this time on this island. They are not going to get rescued. I imagine that Ralph spends most of this book feeling like he is just in crazy town. He spends a huge part of this book trying to tell everyone that if they don't make a fire and keep it going for a smoke signal, they are not going to get rescued. And nobody else seems to take this seriously except for Piggy and like sometimes Sam and Eric, the twins. He gives the choir literally one job. Their only job is to keep this fire going, and they can't handle that. Not only can they not handle it, but when the fire goes out and results in them not getting rescued because there was a ship, they don't even really seem to think it's that big of a deal. So while all of the other boys, most of the other boys, let's leave Piggy out of this, while most of the other boys are off playing at being like hunters and savages or whatever it is that they want to pretend to be, Ralph seems to be the only one who is consistently like, we could die. We will literally die if we don't take this seriously and get ourselves off of this island. And poor Ralph tries so hard with Jack. Jack. It is really, really important as you go through the rest of this book to remind yourself that Jack is an actual child and not a monster. So Jack is the head of the school choir, which is so funny to me because I feel like, of course, it would be the theater kids who take this opportunity to basically do like an immersive theater piece where they all get to pretend that they're like hunters and savages and chiefs and whatever else it is that they pretend they're going to be. Now look, I don't necessarily think that if they had never crashed on this island, Jack was always destined to grow up to be a bloodthirsty tyrant. I don't think that. I do think he was always a little bit of a bully though. I mean, he is nasty and miserable to poor Piggy from the very moment that he meets him. Part of me thinks that Jack probably was bullied at least a little bit at their school before they ended up on this island. He's the head of the choir, which I assume is not like the cool kid activity at their school. He's also head boy, and my only other point of reference for a head boy is Percy Weasley, who we know also sucks. Still, when he starts picking on Piggy, he is punching down. He has a group of friends. He has other people to kind of boss around, right? He has all of the boys in the choir. Piggy has no one. He's a loner on the island. He probably was a loner at home too. Like when Ralph tells all of the other kids that Piggy's nickname is Piggy, even after Piggy specifically asked him not to, I really think he's just being a kid and being an airhead. I don't think he's trying to be mean. When Jack calls Piggy fatty, he's just being a jerk. And that's the major difference between Jack and Ralph, right? Ralph is not a bad kid. Ralph is trying to do the right thing. He's not perfect, but he's basically trying to do right by everyone. Jack is trying to do right by himself. He wants to maintain power. That is his, primary goal. We see this from the very beginning. Jack wants to just, appoint himself chief of the island. It's Ralph and Piggy who decide that they should have an election, and all of the other kids vote for Ralph to be their leader because even they can tell that the vibes are off with Jack. But Ralph wants to be fair, so he tells Jack that he'll be in charge of the choir. He gets to be head theater kid. And he even lets Jack choose what their job will be. So Jack picks hunters, which of course turns into a whole thing later. But it's literally like they're getting ready to play a pretend game, right? And they're all like, well, who are you going to be? Who are we going to be? What's our job, right? Because clearly Jack is a child and is not qualified to do anything at all, much less lead a band of hunters. Anyway, Jack sucks, but I don't think he is necessarily a murderer when they land on the island. So what happens to him? I think method acting is what happens to him. I really think that Jack just gets so completely wrapped up in this game. The longer they're on this island, the harder it gets for him to touch grass, right? He even refers to it as playing once or twice. He's like, well, we're not going to play anymore. But the longer it goes on, the more blurred these lines become between the game and the reality of their situation. Which is why it is so gut-wrenching at the end of the book when Jack comes out of the forest and sees that they've been rescued. It says, a little boy who wore the remains of an extraordinary black cap on his red hair and who carried the remains of a pair of spectacles at his waist started forward, then changed his mind and stood still. He's just a little boy. Even after everything, he's still just a kid, and we see him kind of remember that about himself in that moment when he sees another adult again. Or when he sees an adult, I should say, not another adult, because he's not an adult. Also, we can't forget the fact that if the grown-ups hadn't shown up, he would have literally had Ralph's head on a stake. Speaking of heads that Jack would have had on a stake, can we just take a moment of silence for Piggy? We never even learned this kid's real name. Piggy is easily the most intelligent kid on the island, and he probably is the one who should have been in charge. But he has bad eyesight, and he has asthma, and he's not as physically strong as the other boys, so it never even really occurs to him that maybe he should be the leader. And it certainly does not occur to the other boys. Except maybe to Ralph, because Piggy ends up functioning as sort of an advisor to Ralph. Every good idea that Ralph has over the course of the book originates with Piggy. He's also the only one on the island who is as concerned as Ralph is with maintaining some kind of order and making sure that they get off this island alive, which is why it sucks that Piggy is one of the only kids who does not make it off of the island alive. And look, as someone who literally cannot see without my glasses, I know I'm not wearing them right now, I have contacts in, but without something I literally cannot see, it broke my heart when Jack broke Piggy's glasses. I literally can't imagine anything worse than being on a deserted island with only my glasses and having them break. I would not be able to function effectively in my house, much less would I be able to survive on a deserted island with a bunch of feral little boys. And when Piggy died, I cried because all Piggy ever wanted was for things to be fair and safe and for them to all get off of that island. And not only did everyone fight him on it constantly, but they were cruel to him. They were mean from the very beginning for no real reason. And then they took away his literal eyesight. So we've got Ralph, we've got Piggy, we've got Jack. But who is the Lord of the Flies, actually? It's not any of them. It's kind of all of them. Actually, it's a severed pig head. Let me explain. So throughout the novel, the little kids and eventually some of the big kids are afraid of this beast that they believe is on the island. Some of them claim to have seen the beast before, but nobody has any real proof. There's no real evidence that this thing exists, but everyone's afraid of it. So when Jack kills a pig for them to eat, he decides that they are going to leave the severed head of the pig on a stake as an offering to the beast to keep them all safe. Ralph's trying to build a fire to send up smoke signals to get them rescued. Jack is keeping everyone safe by putting pig heads on stakes. That's all I'm saying. So the pig's head was meant to be an offering to the beast, but actually it kind of is the beast, or it represents the beast. The beast and the Lord of the Flies is the evil force on the island that leads all these little boys to become cruel and violent when they're left to their own devices. So the question is this beast indigenous to the island? Or was it always kind of somewhere inside of these boys and only had the chance to really come out because of this situation they ended up in? And then finally, we cannot finish talking about this book without going over the absolute irony of the way that the boys finally get rescued. And you know what? It would have happened a lot sooner if Jack would have just kept the fire going like Ralph asked him to. But Jack needs to be in charge, so he's not going to do anything unless it's his own idea. And it's only when he is hunting down Ralph so that he can put his head on a stake that he finally gets a fire going. But of course it gets completely out of control and he's going to burn down the entire island, and then it sends up enough smoke for them to get rescued. I just really hope that when they got back to England that Jack wasn't heralded as this hero who saved all of the boys when he literally made it as difficult as he possibly could for Ralph from the very beginning. So I actually ended up enjoying this book a lot. It seems like a very straightforward story, but when you get into it, there are just so many layers that you can keep peeling away between all of the symbols and the relationships between the characters. There's so much to unpack. So much that I will never really have a chance to get to all of it in one of these videos. But if you have a question about The Lord of the Flies or an observation or something else that you think it would be helpful to discuss, let me know in the comments and I will get back to you.